Good afternoon, everyone. Um, we are going to start our hybrid event, and I greet the presence of the Honorable Deputy Minister, Buti Manamela, who's with us to grace this occasion as well as to engage with us on this very critical and a very difficult and a very important topic that is a massive challenge that remains ahead of us as we discuss the gender-based violence and sexual and gender-based violence-related misconducts at our PSET institutions. I also have the honor of having the Vice-Chancellor of University of UNISA, the host university, but she also happens to be the chairperson of the PSET Gender-Based Violence Technical Task Team. And thank you, VC, for hosting as well as chairperson for your presence. Equally, I must also welcome everyone who's joined us on different platforms. I see there are over 200 people on Zoom platform. There are many people, and as they keep joining us as the time progresses, I also would like to welcome the other viewers who are listening to us from Facebook, from Twitter, and many other social media, including YouTube and LinkedIn, as is being relayed live on many platforms. I equally also greet media houses. Thank you for taking this vision to our public, to our people, so that we can engage with them on this pertinent issue. And I greet them and I welcome them too. And also the media houses that are physically present with us in this meeting. I welcome all the members of the Gender-Based Violence Technical Task Team, and one of this critical part of this webinar is to ensure that the technical task team hears views from the minister, the vision of the deputy minister, department, and of course engaging with the public in general and our institutions that have joined, whether it's universities, TVET colleges, CETs, private higher education, or skill-based centers. Equally, it's an absolute honor to also welcome a friend, Bernard, who is from Europe Union, the head of the delegation or head of cooperation. Bernard, thank you very much. I'm sure during the period we will hear this massive collaboration with Europe and South Africa, and your hands joining us in this difficult fight of this pandemic called gender-based violence. And we really gratefully thank your presence and Europe Union partnering, as this problem doesn't remain only in South Africa. It's a global problem, and it equally happens in the post-school education, I'm sure, in Europe, as we see data coming all across the global world. And so I also welcome all the partners, United Nations Women. They're also part of our technical task team, South African Police Service, Department of Justice, representation from Medical Research Council, all our branches in the Department of Higher Education, Department of Justice, and if I have missed any, civil society specifically, and our student formulations that have also joined us. But I will keep introducing them as the program progresses during the course. I think it will be unfair if we do not start with a moment of silence, especially knowing what happened to Nosikelo very recently at University of Fort Hare, and many more lives that we have experienced over last so many decades. To our knowledge goes, for young people who have, or people in general who have succumbed to this pandemic of gender-based violence. And equally, I felt when we're taking this moment of silence, we also devote our silence to people we have lost through COVID pandemic. And these are two major pandemics that are running parallel as we speak to all of us. So with your permission, let's give ourselves a minute of silence with that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me start the program by asking the chairperson of the PSET Gender-Based Violence Technical Task Team, who also is the Vice Chancellor of UNISA, to address us and also welcome everyone. With that note, VC, over to you.
Molweni, Dumelang, Sanbonan. Good afternoon. Where is the energy in the room, colleagues?
Good afternoon.
Yes, you're sounding sad. Yes, yes. I understand. Thank you very much, Professor Aluwalia, for inviting us to this launch of the PSET Sexual and Gender-Related Misconduct Procedural Protocols, which our Deputy Minister of Science and Technology, Mr. Buti Manamela, as the head and the leader within our own National Department of Higher Education, Science and Technology, will be leading for us as a society. I'd like to start by first acknowledging yourself, Program Director, the Deputy Minister of Higher Education and Science and Innovation, Mr. Buti Manamela, the Chief Executive Officer, yourself, Professor Ramnik, Your Excellency Ambassador Ray, representing the European Commission, and all other diplomatic corps present today, members of the University and Management Executive here in present or even in the virtual platforms. I note the Dean of Students, Dr. Olwetu Supuka, Professor Masinga, present in the event, representatives of various institutions of higher learning in the PSET system, presenters by Gbv experts Erica Mdon and Ms. Crystal Dix, members of the panel of discussants amongst us, Ms. N. Guthuku Chongwe, country representative, UN Women, Ms. Tamara Matebula, chairperson of Commission on Gender Equality, Professor Dipulani Putisi, a good sister and mentor, whom we share the Free State as home, but also an environment, Deputy President of SAPCO, SAU's leadership of the university and PSET system, SAVETSA leadership. I think this is quite important for us to recognize both the partnership of the European Union, the civil society, national, provincial, and local government representatives from the Gbv experts attending in person but virtually, distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen. I often note that protocols tend to be long, but if we do not acknowledge them, then we would not have done our responsibility. I want to start, Deputy Minister and members who are participating this morning, this afternoon, at the launch this afternoon, to start with a sincere acknowledgement of the pain that our society goes through when gender-based violence become widespread, especially in institutions of higher learning. Precisely because institutions of higher learning ought not to mimic what's in the society, but through knowledge that's researched through engaged scholarship, teaching and learning, and research, and the formation of students as intellectual, must be communities of practice and of knowledge who enable society to overcoming the scourge of gender-based violence. The GBV is not limited to students, but sometimes include educators who assault their students. In many ways, it reflects the prevalence of gender-based violence across the country. We hold the discussions today 3 days after the anniversary of the brutal killing of Uyene Mkhwetana, whose murder at the Claremont Post Office put a spotlight on both GBV and femicide across South Africa, but also as a great threat for youth and young adults in our society. As we do so, hardly 3 years, we also mourned just recently DM, and you were there to support the family, but also the university grieving the brutal killing of a young woman at Fort Hare. And this is something that we must guard against, for addressing sexual violence on our campuses is something that should not be negotiable. It should be a non-negotiable, precisely because we need to urgently tackle it, and all institutions must come together to overcoming. It is very clear that the action is needed and needed expeditiously. Today's event should lead us towards implementation of an effective plan that will render campuses safe. What we also need is a culture of zero tolerance towards all instances of gender-based violence on our campuses, in our societies, but also using knowledge to ensure that we change this scourge. There should be no silence. There should be no muting of voices of those who are agitating against violence. A culture of silence often creates room for this terrible behavior and violence, and creating platforms for people to transforming gender-based violence should be something that campuses allow and should enable the reporting of sexual violence, sexual harassment, gender-based violence, or any acts that disable the full participation or flourishing, especially of women, and also of LGBTQIA+ persons, as well as students or staff living with disabilities. Survivors should not be re-traumatized or traumatized by hostile processes that do not only, that are indifferent or impatient in addressing the acts or the efforts towards overcoming GBV. I also would like to assess that some of the intervention measures that will hopefully enable effective implementation require ample and clear communication around the consequences. Many a times, the perpetrators are not the focal point, but those who are harmed. And it will be important that we prioritize that. The second aspect that I think is quite integral, not only for individuals, but for institutions, is the whole idea of accountability and policy systems that enable addressing gender-based violence. The last part that I think is important as a critical structural imperative is ensuring that the policies and procedures prioritize prevention, responsiveness, initiative, and are not only responding when harm has already been manifest. There should be absolute clarity that gender-based violence includes all forms of unwanted comments, advances, rape or attempted rape, sexual abuse, and any attempt to obtaining sexual acts without the consent or the agreement of people who are being pestered. There's nothing like an innocent act of unwanted sexual touching or predatory forms of blowing kisses that have not been invited, or aggressive sexual behavior where women's bodies are trampled upon or are looked at with ways that are not enabling their dignity to manifest. And I think when we talk about gender-based violence, we prioritize women and girls, but also understanding, in the words of many feminist scholars, that sometimes men who are considered effeminate also become the subjects of gender-based violence. The language used in policies on sexual violence also must be accessible to everyone, including in African languages, so that within the university systems, but also in our society, we clearly understand why it is important to respecting gender equality, gender justice, and the very regulatory framework that our university systems, but also society, has created in the implementation processes of our universities. The code of ethics that has been developed and the multiplicities of protocols that higher health and the PSET system has created are quite important for us to implementing in our universities if we are to overcome gender-based violence. I thank you and wish us the best deliberations, but also actions towards overcoming gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson, for sharing your vision and exactly steering and spearheading our technical task team. I think one of the reason why we have engaged today and why we are meeting up today is the purpose of this meeting is to release and to follow up on last year when history from our side was very important. And I know people do say that South Africa writes one of the best policies in the world, but when it comes to implementation, that's where we struggle. But one thing is very important, that we became the first government department and the first sector since the President of South Africa launched a national strategic plan on gender-based violence. And we launched a gender-based violence higher education policy and framework, which was released and launched by the Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Blaine Nzimande, in 2020 July. And since then, there has been the whole focus towards how do we now make that policy into practical implementation. Because the real meaning of a policy will be is when it's into practical implementation. The other important part is that this policy pushes every institution of higher education, whether it's a university, whether it's a TVET college, whether it's a community education college, a campus in Ulundi, a campus in Bizana, or in campus in Alex, to an urban campus like we are in Makaleni campus or UNISA, to put structures, to put infrastructure, to put systems, to put controls when it comes to this pandemic, like we have done for HIV, we're doing now for COVID, we're doing it for mental health, and I think sexual and gender-based violence should also now become a core mandate of institutional perspective of their key deliverables and KPIs that they do in their own institutions. So one of the biggest work that happens is in two phases, as our policy speaks about. One, can we prevent? And I think DM's vision has always been, whenever I speak to him, he keeps explaining to us behavior change and focus on prevention, because the aim is to avoid more and more cases happening among our young people, whether it's in our campuses or outside our campuses, but it affects the young people in the post-school system. And how do you expect that young person to qualify or have the skills or become a graduate competent or become a person who can go into the competitive market and earn a living for the family if that person is traumatized? That person is suffering or living with an abusive relationship or is having gender-based violence. And sometimes these abusive relationships can end up to a stage of nosikelo. That's exactly what we have experienced. So the early diagnosis, early picking of these abusive relationships, and that can only be achieved through education, prevention programs, awareness, which I will have a privilege to speak about it once Erica and Crystal will do a presentation on the 3 key deliverables that are supposed to be presented today. But that is after a case has happened. So there is a lot of work that needs to happen before any case should ever happen, because we should prevent GBV. But we should also be ready at early stages of how we can intervene, how we can stop gender-based violence in our campuses. For that, we need to put structures, we need to put policies, we need to put infrastructure, we need to put systems, and we need to put controls. Right from evidence, safeguarding evidence, first line of respondent, should a case of sexual assault, rape, or gender-based violence happen on our campuses. From capacity in our security to a survivor support, to a safe room, establishment of a safe room, availability of a psychosocial support, close partnership with the judicial system, in our own system, development of disciplinary tribunals, which are multi-sectoral, well represented with women, well represented with civil society, well represented with students, so that a decision can be non-biased and we can make responsive decisions should any case of sexual or gender-based violence happen on campus. So we released today implementation procedural guidelines on sexual and gender-related misconduct in PSET institutions. For every step, checklists, minimum standards, minimum controls that needs to be in place to tackle this epidemic, should this pandemic happen more and more in our campuses as it continues to haunt us. Then protocols, implementing protocols on rape and sexual assault. What does an institution do then should a case or a rape or sexual assault is reported? And then a protocol on code of ethics. So I think I won't waste more time. I'd rather invite Erica. These are our technical working group that has now released these documents through our technical task team from higher education to please come and share the work on these 3 important areas so that we can now start implementing programs on gender-based violence. I just want to check with our technical team if the presentation, or Erica, can you hear us? Can you be, we can't hear you for now.
Just
yes.
Can you hear me?
Thanks. Over to you, Erica. We can hear you. Your slides are also available. So good to go. Thank you.
Right. I just want to get rid of that little block, which says, yeah, there we go. Right. Can we put it onto the slideshow presentation, Pinder? Or I'm sorry, I'm just wanting it to be full screen, if possible. Otherwise, I'll just continue.
We can see it, please. Can you confirm?
Screen. There we go. As long as you can all see it. So as background, as the CEO of Higher Health, Ramneek, mentioned, Higher Health has been involved in the area of GBV for some time now. In 2018, it prepared the policy framework, which then was presented to the Department of Higher Education and Training, DEET. And in 2020, as he mentioned, the Minister released the framework, the DEET policy framework on gender-based violence. Now, what's very important about the framework, and I've highlighted it here, is that it impels each institution, each PACT institution is now compelled to put in place mechanisms to raise awareness of GBV and ensure that victims are supported and assisted should they experience GBV. So in other words, there's now a responsibility for each and every campus to start addressing it. And what Higher Health has done is it's created broad sexual and gender-related misconduct implementation guidelines. And these are what I'm going to be talking about today. And then when I'm finished, the CEO, Ramneek, will talk about the more comprehensive preventative measures that Higher Health is going to embark upon. So to start with, I just want to stress that the DHET framework is a response to policy and programming, the policy and programming framework, which was provided in the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. So let's carry on, and I'll start giving you more information. So what we have done is we have prepared implementation guidelines, principles and protocols for campuses to adopt on gender-based violence. Now, baseline principles which have been drafted set out the basic standards that everyone on all campuses must abide by and adhere to. Those principles are guiding principles, much like our Bill of Rights are the guiding principles of our Constitution, but these are guiding principles on gender-based violence. Then we have drafted implementation guidelines which include what behavior constitutes gender-based violence, so that no one is, there's a general understanding and no one can deny any particular kind of behavior is not gender-based violence. The implementation guidelines deal with how to report gender-based violence, how each campus, each institution must investigate it, and the disciplinary processes and consequences of GBV. And then there's a code of ethic that has been prepared, ready for signature by all members of the campus community. And then various minimum standards protocols are being prepared. Some have already been prepared. For example, what higher institutions should do about rape, sexual assault, safety on campus, and other things, which I'll get to later. So who do these GBV implementation guidelines cover? What is their jurisdiction? Well, anyone can be a victim regardless of their sex or gender. The campus community is covered, which includes students, full-time, part-time, or remote, staff, members of governance bodies like senates and councils and boards, external partners, consultants, external service providers, and contractors. Basically, behavior both on and off campus is covered, i.e. on field, school trips, conferences, and travel. And both current and students and staff and former students and staff are covered, visiting staff and students, partner organizations that are members of the campus community are all going to be covered by these implementation guidelines. And the next slide, please. Behavior. So as I said earlier, we need to have in writing in a very detailed manner, have set out what behavior constitutes gender-based violence, because very frequently people seem to sometimes say that they don't really believe that what they did constituted gender-based violence, and we need to all be very clear on this. So some of the definitions we've put into the implementation guidelines are based on the Code of Good Practice on the handling of sexual harassment in the workplace, which is a very comprehensive list of definitions. And then we've included just the general definitions, which include verbal, non-verbal, cyber abuse, physical abuse, sexual assault, rape, sexual exploitation, sexual favoritism, victimization, intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, discriminatory abuse, trafficking, abuse of power, quid pro quo harassment, grooming, and the creation of a hostile work or learning environment. And this is very important from a preventative aspect, that everyone understands, and an awareness raising aspect, what gender-based violence is, and that it's a very broad spectrum of activities which cause harm to people. And then the other thing that everyone needs to understand, and that's also put very clearly in the implementation guidelines, is what constitutes consent. So consent cannot be given if a person is not fully conscious, or if the person is under threat of force or intimidation, or false pretenses or fraud are used. Relenting and submitting does not mean consent. And unequal power relations weaken a person's ability to not consent. Both parties to sexual activity are responsible to ascertain if there's free consent without coercion. And consent for one instance of sexual activity doesn't necessarily mean consent for others, and nor does past consent mean consent for future activity. Silence does not imply consent, and consent must be explicit, and no means no. So the guidelines have a clause on consent so that no one is confused or ill-informed in regard to what real consent is. Okay. We've provided in the guidelines that poor safeguarding practice has to be eradicated, and institutions must maintain proper standards of care and support in line with these GBV implementation guidelines and in line with the DHET framework. And so, for example, some of the examples of poor practice we all have to deal with is insufficient care being taken to prevent abuse and harm, so insufficient preventative activity, allowing abusive or concerning practices to go unreported, so not having systems for reporting, failure to run preventative and behavior changing programs and awareness campaigns. These must now become pretty much mandatory. Failing to ensure that service providers and contractors and partners adhere to these GBV implementation guidelines. And then the actual issues around how the campuses are organized, inadequate lighting and security, other safety measures have to be introduced. Placing students in potentially compromising and uncomfortable situations or dangerous situations. For example, accommodation too far from campus or unlit, and failing to adhere to relevant guidelines and protocols and procedures, including health and safety guidelines. So in the implementation guidelines, which we've drafted, we have called for a responsible office to be on every single institution of higher learning, every PSET institution. This could be an office, a whole office, like a gender office. If the institution doesn't have the resources, it could be a person or a few people who are the gender responsible people. But this office or people, we're calling the responsible office, deals with all complaints by victims of gender-based violence. And it must be a distinct and separate office in recognition that gender-based violence requires specialized, consistent, and informed responses. So it's not in the HR department, it's not in student affairs, it's its own institution that's specific, its own office, its own entity that is specifically focused on gender-based violence. And it must have executive seniority support and be at the highest possible level in the institution. In other words, the principal of the institution and the Senate or board of the institution must take this office very seriously and be essentially responsible for it. And it's that office or person is tasked with implementing the guidelines, these guidelines, protocols, minimum standards, and so on, to ensure safety on campus and ensure proper responses. So then we go into quite a lot of detail on what must happen when somebody has been a victim of gender-based violence. An incident of gender-based violence can be reported by anybody. So anybody who witnesses it or sees it, or the victim themselves can report it. And anybody can be on or off campus if they see gender-based violence taking place, must report it. And the person to whom it is reported should try as much as possible and quickly as possible to get that incident report to the responsible office that we just referred to. It is mandatory to report to the responsible office if it's suspected that there's been gender-based violence perpetrators. Everybody needs to have their ears and eyes open, and it is important that everyone takes responsibility for reporting. Obviously, the victim themselves would report too, but I'm just saying as a community, we should all be taking responsibility. There's no threshold on reporting, no matter how minor. And a complainant who wants to report to the office can also report to South African Police Services and can follow both routes should he or she choose to. And a complainant may choose not to pursue action, but in which case the responsible office can, particularly if it sees risk. Okay, thank you. Next one. Okay, we've also adopted a complainant-centered approach. This involves confidentiality, That's one of the key issues. Information is only available to a limited number of people when there's been a report of gender-based violence. And anonymity, a complainant must be able to remain anonymous if they choose, which they can up to a certain point. You'll see in the procedures it gets more difficult to remain anonymous if a formal hearing takes place. A complainant may withdraw the matter, as we mentioned, but they may also choose an informal process or a formal process or report to the South African police. And then lastly, supportive and protective measures must be provided to complainants or victims of gender-based violence. That's part of a complainant-centered approach. The supportive and protective measures that we've mentioned in the policy are the fact that the complainant, there must be psychosocial support, medical support, possibly sick leave, no contact and restriction of activity orders, change of student res where applicable or barring alleged perpetrators from residence, change of academic classes if need be, or academic concessions given to student victims, suspension or special leave for staff, alleged perpetrators, or leave of absence for student alleged perpetrators. And the aim is to secure the safety of the complainant and a guard against any further harm. And there are, of course, a lot of other types of support, but these are some of the major ones. And then we talk about the processes that a victim can adopt if they have been subjected to gender-based violence. They must submit a statement to the responsible office, which must be responded to very quickly, 5 days. And then there are different choices. Either the alleged perpetrator should be approached directly and spoken to, or an internal informal mediation and discussion can take place, or an external mediation. The respondent has a right to state their case and be given information on options and reply. And at any point, a complainant can switch to a formal process or withdraw her complaint or his complaint. The complainant, as I mentioned, may remain anonymous up to a certain point. And for sexual assault and rape, which are serious infractions, we propose that the formal process must be used. It's mandatory. A formal process is where the complainant, where the university, where the institution, the responsible office appoints an investigator who conducts a full investigation on the basis of all available evidence, and this must be complete within 30 days. The investigator must interview the victim and the respondent separately, interview other relevant third-party witnesses separately, and request any additional documentation and or information that they deem relevant, keep a record of all action taken, and ensure that all records concerning the matter are kept confidential. And then that will result in a report, and recommendations will be made, either that a formal hearing should take place or that the matter has no merit. And so let's go on to the next slide, which is a hearing panel gets constituted if the formal hearing is to take place. The responsible office recommends a panel which must be appointed. It's usually 3 members. One would be a gender expert or specialist. Witnesses can be called. Both parties can have support people, but no lawyers unless special reasons. It's an internal disciplinary process, so there's no need for lawyers. It's essentially inquisitorial, which means that the whole purpose of the hearing panel is to find out as much information as possible, inquire into what happened, and they make a finding on the balance of probabilities. And the panel uses the investigation report that was already prepared to inform the hearing and evidence already available, but it can also hear oral evidence. And at the end, it makes a finding, and either party can appeal under certain conditions. And that essentially is the end of the process if a person is going to make a complaint. Now, the CEO, Ramneek, mentioned the Code of Ethics, and we've spoken about the Code of Ethics and what's being proposed. This is in the DHET framework document as well, is that all people who come onto a campus should be commit themselves to this Code of Ethics, which is a form of compact which everyone must sign. And it really just tells each other, and one signs into it to say that one will adhere to the highest ethical standards of behavior, integrity and honesty, respect for human dignity. One will comply with the rules and regulations and policies of the institution, respect one another, not bully or discriminate one another, or get involved in harassment or abuse. There'd be respectful classroom behavior, no interruption or disruption of lectures, an open exchange of ideas, because an institution of higher learning should allow open exchange, but no hate speech. So within that, the boundaries of decency and dignity, and an avoidance of alcohol abuse, because sexual and gender-based violence has been strongly connected to alcohol abuse. Thank you. We've also prepared a rape protocol, and we're just showing you what that would be. It's how an actual institution must deal with rape and sexual assault. For example, if during working hours, rapes and sexual assaults must go to the responsible office, but if they take place after hours, they must be reported to people who are trained and know how to respond to reports of rape, first responders. So institutions of higher learning are going to have these first responders who are trained. Whoever receives a report of rape must know how to take a statement and assist the victim. There's special supportive mechanisms, taking statements and assisting people who report rape. Support might include also taking them to report to South African police services if they choose, and advising on the medical facilities and medical examinations which are necessary. And then also there's some other issues regarding rape. For example, off-campus accommodation must be in areas that do not expose students to rape. When an incident is not reported to the responsible office as soon as possible, it must go there so that the steps outlined in this whole implementation guideline can be embarked on. So in other words, as soon as it gets to the responsible office, they would take over a whole investigation process and a disciplinary process. The responsible office must provide psychological support and all the other supports we mentioned. And all reports of rape and sexual assault must be investigated. They cannot be left. And of course, there's also the option of in parallel reporting it to the South African police services. Right, so I've gone through very rapidly what the implementation guidelines say that have been prepared, but there's some next steps that are going to be taking place. Firstly, these ones relate to further documentation that's going to be prepared. They're going to be protocols, minimum standards and checklists on femicide, on staff-student relationships, and campus safety and security, for example, lighting and security. We're going to be preparing templates to accompany the implementation guidelines, just to make them more easy to implement. And we're also preparing a monitoring and evaluation system, which includes checklists to ensure that PZ institutions are compliant, because it's now becoming mandatory to put all of this in place. A capacity development and training program is a second thing that Higher Health will be embarking on. This will be to train people on the GBV principles, on these implementation guidelines in more detail than we've managed to go through today, much more detail, on rape protocols, on the Code of Ethics, on other protocols that are still being drafted. And this capacity development and training will be given in September to the following forums: the Transformation Managers Forum, the Deans of Students Affairs Forum, Camprosa, Campus Health, HODs, student groups, HR directors forums, DEET regional managers, and SACPO. And then in October, November, TVETs in 6 DHET regions and all the 26 universities and student leadership will, the capacity development and training program will be given to all of those people, including to transformation managers, gender officers, deans of student affairs, management, SRCs, and security. So that by the end of the year, everyone who needs to know about these implementation guidelines and what should be done and how to manage gender-based violence will know what it's all about, and hopefully then PSET institutions will have adopted these different guidelines. And now the last part of what Higher Health is going to be doing relates to awareness and prevention. And this is key. And I'm actually going to hand over to the CEO, Ramneek, because I think he's going to continue just going through in a little bit more detail the type of awareness and prevention programs that Higher Health will be embarking upon, very much relating to earlier experience it has in the areas of HIV, AIDS, and COVID, but this is specific to gender-based violence. So I think, Ramneek, are you going to take over here? If I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure if Ramneek can hear me.
Erica, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Thanks, Erica. I appreciate. If you can just help me read the slides, it'd be easier for me. But I think the other third big parameter of implementation has to be in prevention. And that's going to be the biggest effort that has to be put in place. What we need to do is, what we have done is we have put up a curriculum on gender-based violence. And it's an extramural curriculum. It's already in place. It's already in implementation. I'm very proud to announce that at least 500,000 young South Africans in our post-school system enrolled into this curriculum. And when they enrolled into this curriculum, they could actually come and learn gender-based violence through the peer-to-peer engagement. And what we want is a very practical learning of gender-based violence through survivors, through people giving experiences, so that people can understand gender-based violence through an educational perspective. And we are educational institutions, so we must run education curriculums. But one thing what we made mandatory is that any young person who is coming and enrolling itself into this curriculum needs to undergo early risk detection of students that are at risk of being victims or perpetrators of GBV. So in a class, when 500,000 South Africans were in this class, and they can do early risk detection, which means at domestic violence, they can identify themselves as early abusive relationship, or in a partner violence, they can find themselves into any kind of early stages of abusive relationships, even the late stages. And of course, when it comes to sexual assault, and most importantly, perpetrators, because in the same class, there are also perpetrators who can identify themselves as perpetrators. So there's a screening system for perpetrators. So it is purely peer-led GBV support structures, establishing survivor groups in the institutions of higher learning, and through curriculum, through extramural curriculum, and through these peer-to-peer-led activities, the aim is to engage awareness and make people understand gender-based violence, give them peer support on the gender-based violence. And I think there's nothing better than a peer supporting another peer and building into it. And I think that is what we wanted to speak about it. The other important thing is access of campuses with interventions like PEP, access to rape kits, but these are still not prevention. These are things that are still to be put in place so that if should any case happens, these mechanisms do exist in our institution. And also, very importantly, as the guidelines were presented, is about establishing safe rooms for young people and any staff or student who has been a victim of sexual and rape assault. Is there any next slide? I think it's quite a busy slide, but I just wanted to acknowledge the Gender-Based Violence Technical Task Team. we've kind of built it in a way, it's multi-sectoral. You can see, and I'm gratefully thanking, not in a particular order, but starting with SATWETSA, which is a South African Technical Vocational and Education and Training Student Association, and we need students from TVET sector to guide us. I'm grateful to United Nations, whether it's UNFPA, UN Women, South African Police Service, Department of Justice, Commission of Gender Equality, SAUS, which is our South African Union of Students in Universities, Medical Research Council, Department of Women, Youth and People with Disability, who is the custodian of the National Strategic Plan. From our department, the planning branch, the TVET branch, the university branch, the CET branch, and of course, civil society. And grateful to Bafana Kumalo from Sonke Gender, Sonke Gender, specifically from men perspective and men's sector to guide us, and of course, University South Africa. Next slide. This project has to be not only just for universities, not for TVET colleges, and not just for CET colleges. It has to be engraved under our private higher education, our 21 CETAs, our national skills development providers, NSF providers, QCTO providers. So it speaks to entire post-school education and training. Next slide. And probably the last slide of my interventions, and this is the second curriculum from the primary level. We have put now a 24-hour helpline, and I still appeal every young person in South Africa. The number is 0800 363636. Anytime, 24 hours, whether it's 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, pick up a call and you will find counselors, psychologists, social workers, because not only gender-based violence, but it's interrelation to mental health. We need to have this 24-hour crisis line in presence, peer-to-peer education, capacity building. Our radio program, we've got 21 campus radio program, and gender-based violence should be a campaign that needs to continuously make awareness so that every young woman in South Africa finds itself safe. With that note, I'll stop here, but I would go to the next part of our program, which is to bring our discussants. And I think it's very important from the prevention, from the modeling of implementation and the guidelines that have been released. I think it's very important that we discuss this. And it's a huge honor for me to invite our first discussant, who is a very close friend. In fact, somebody we look forward to, because they bring the whole global understanding of this pandemic to us, which is United Nations Women. The country director of UN Women, Anne Shongwei, is with us. And I would really call on to make us understand from the global perspective, from your thinking around, are we on the right track, what more needs to be done, and specifically from the experience that you bring on our technical task team. So Anne, I'm going to hand it over to you. Please, can we switch to Anne, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Ramneek. I hope I can be seen. Can you see me?
Yes, we can, and over to you, Anne. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And honestly, the presentation has been really excellent and very telling. And congratulations for this amazing work. I want to acknowledge the Deputy Minister and his leadership in this work, and really to congratulate him for staying in front with this work of leadership, but also to the Minister in his absence, and also to yourself, Ramneek, as a CEO of Higher Health, Program Director, to our other panelists, to all of us on the task team who are showing some results now by being able to move forward with this work. So I just want to say that one of the things that has been very exciting about this partnership with Higher Health for us as UN Women is the fact that we actually have a global program for he for she, which I think many of you may know. And what is interesting about that program is that the program, working with multiple universities, was designed to look at how to become effective in gender responsiveness in tertiary institutions. Some are universities, some are colleges. And so as we look at what Higher Health has put on the table for these programs, we want to recognize that the first thing that is very useful is to be able to have a policy that can actually, and guidelines that can guide every single tertiary institution. Because what we found is a lot of differences and a lack of consistency, and therefore clearer indicators for what needs to happen institution by institution. So you find one that is very advanced and another one that is lagging far behind. The second thing is to have a very strong investment, not in on students as a homogeneous group, but to actually have some targeted work. Now you've got awareness raising, you've got different programs that you're establishing with peers. I think what for us has been so important, and what we've learned from countries across the world, is the necessity to have targeted programs. Let's identify where we may have hotspots. Of course, we don't know about hotspots until an event happens. But sometimes there is a trend that informs us that there may be something happening in these areas. So I'm not sure how clear you are about the hotspots in the tertiary institutions, but it would be very important to then understand what is actually going on there. And Ramneek, I know that you were able to participate in our Safer Cities program that we have. And this is a program that audits environments. We're able to use our audit tools to be able to see what safety would look like. If you want to create an environment that is safe, secure, an ecosystem that men and women in the tertiary institutions are able to operate freely, to be able to do that, you need to know and understand what some of the threats are and what is the behavior that is not just inside the institution, but also in the environment around that institution. And so that's a tool that we hope we will eventually be able to include in the package of services that you have. Going back to my he for she story, it is at two levels that is important. The one is ensuring that the leadership of every single tertiary institution makes it his business and her business. But I say his first because many of the leaders still are men. I know we have many, many more women leaders now, but we want to be sure that we have our leaders, our vice chancellors, our faculty, who are taking full responsibility to ensure that under their watch, they will not have cases of violence under their watch. And so leading from in front and being held accountable for that through performance contracts and whatever system there is in the institution. Then there is the he for she peer engagements at the school level, at the college level, at the university level. And you are doing a lot of work, but I think from a prevention perspective, we have to be able to identify what are norms and beliefs and stereotypes that perpetuate violence in and around the universities, in and around the colleges. So we need to understand this. And to understand this means that we are actually doing some really close profiling and mapping and being able to conduct targeted conversations that ensure and processes that ensure that we can actually change the game. You know, we've talked many times about the programs we've had in the taverns and how GBV has changed so dramatically in those taverns. And the reason they changed is because of continuous and consistent work with the leaders and the patrons of taverns. So we need to get inside the head of young men and boys who are in our institutions to really understand and provide the support that they need to be able to continue to drive this work. Then in terms of the policy itself, how to actually implement this policy? How do we make sure that there is a real plan for the implementation of the policy across every institution? What is our tracking system? So for us as the technical task team, we need to be able to come back every few quarters and be able to reflect and see, can we in fact show evidence that there has been a change in the work that we're doing? And so we at UN Women are going to standing here to provide that support. So we'll continue the technical support that's needed to roll out the monitoring of this gender-based violence policy framework. We want to continue to work with you in coordinating the Safer Cities and Safe Public Spaces methodology as a tool for how to, map and profile in your communities. But also we've worked and we're working hand in hand with you with support of MTN on an online GBV platform that will help us to gather information, to use it for prevention, to be able to coordinate conversations.
Okay, thank you.
Of the tools that, so comments, but to say that is who want colleges, who want to do he for she, is to establish this he for she proven solutions insights tools with you so that we can implement them consistently across all 100 plus institutions that fall under you. So that it's not one or two or three institutions that do this, but that we actually are able to roll it out hand in hand with you to be able to create that impact. So thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity. Excited to hear some more.
Thank you, and just to inform you that I personally believe in he for she, and higher education and post-school education believes in he for she. There is no way we can ever be successful if a he doesn't stand for a she. And I think the concept of he for she that the UN Women, and I have practically seen it globally, whether it's police department in United Kingdom or Scotland Yard or areas where men have taken charge towards responsible understanding of he for she, and we totally believe in this. I absolutely confirm with you that going forward, our next target of frameworks establishment or guidelines were on campus safety and security and audits that will have to actually be a directives towards these important work that you have mentioned. Gender equality remains a principal driver of gender-based violence, and we need to maintain that gender-based violence curriculum of peer-to-peer right from the beginning, whether it's school system or when they enter into institutions, and our curriculum speak on gender equality, because there's no way GBV can be achieved without gender equality in this regard. So, and we are very grateful, and I know you didn't speak about PESA, but I know how passionate you are, and this is an application tool that UN Women through Higher Health will be releasing for easy access for survivors and support structures that people can engage on. My next discussant is somebody who guides higher health, who guides institutions of higher learning, who guides the sector, who guides our communities, is Commission of Gender Equality. They tell us where things are wrong and we must improve, and that is exactly what we need at this stage. So the chairperson, Tamara Matebola, is with us. And please, if we can switch to Tamara. Tamara, are you available to engage as our next discussant? Thank you, Tamara. And so honored to be having you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramnik, and a very good afternoon to you, colleagues. Let me take this opportunity to congratulate the leadership of the universities, the institutions of higher learning. The technical task team is highly congratulated. Well done in terms of the work that has been done so far. And I would like to acknowledge the Deputy Minister of Higher Education, Mr. Butima Namela, the Vice Chancellor of UNISA, Prof. Puling Linkabula, the CEO of Higher Health, Prof. Alwalia, and all protocol observed. First and foremost, the Commission for Gender Equality wishes to send its deepest condolences to the family of Nosikelo Mtebeni, the University of Fort Hare, as well as the entire PSET and GBV and the technical task team for your loss. And I must say that, your loss is our loss. This is one of the most devastating stories women, both young and old, should not be hearing or reading about during the Women's Month. when we should be celebrating the gains made towards achieving gender equality as a society, and also achieving a society free from all forms of gender discrimination and gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. This incident really represents a manifestation of the obstinacy of gender-based violence and femicide incidences, which are still endemic in our country and in our society. Just to come to the business of the day today, I know that perhaps I need to provide a little bit of background in terms of how we've been working closely with institutions of higher learning dating back to the 2015 to date. Just in terms of providing historical background, as far back as 2015, 2016, the Commission for Gender Equality conducted public investigative hearings on gender transformation and gender-based violence at institutions of higher learning. And this intervention was inspired by the observed slow gender transformation and harassment cases that were reported by the Rhodes University and some other universities that followed. And we were able, as the Commission, to subpoena 4 universities at that time. And it was Rhodes University, the University of Cape Town, the University of Witwatersrand, and UKZN. And all these 4 universities came and appeared before the Commission. And this work was therefore expanded to other universities, and to date a total of 22 universities and 4 TVET colleges have actually been investigated. And based on the work that we have done, we have actually been able to engage these universities, assist them in terms of making strides towards achieving gender transformation, but also making sure that there are pieces of legislations and policies towards achieving gender equality and gender transformation in these institutions. So during the entire time, the Commission was guided by the existing legislations regulating employment equity, such as the Employment Equity Act, number 55 of 1996. We were therefore able to look at the existence of any gender policy frameworks, sexual harassment policies in institutions of higher learning, and we used this as a guiding yardstick in terms of analyzing the existing policies and the practices adopted by tertiary institutions. So following the release of the Commission's report, we were able to actually, with that report, release some binding recommendations that amongst them actually called for the development of a gender policy and a gender policy framework. And this was actually developed and launched not so long ago. And we also called for various institutions to develop their own gender equality and discrimination policies. Amongst those, we looked at institutions developing sexual harassment policies and managed to put structures such as the sexual harassment advisory committees in place to ensure that the implementation and the monitoring of these policies and practices is efficiently and effectively done. So let me stick to my stitches, and in so doing, I want to start by outlining the importance of the linkages between the legal frameworks and the developed gender-based violence policy frameworks for institutions of higher learning that we launched not so long ago. But also, I just want to also make sure that there is linkages with the existing newly developed procedural guidelines on sexual and gender-related misconducts, the new protocols on rape and sexual assault cases, and on the PSET codes of ethics that have recently been developed. And in emphasizing this need for linkages, I must actually say that the first place to look for or to look at is the supreme law, which is the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, which has been widely hailed as one of the most progressive as well as comprehensive document of its type in the world. It is therefore imperative for all laws, legislative and policy frameworks, guidelines and protocols, including the ones that we are talking about today, are aligned and harmonized with the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. For an example, if you look at Chapter 2 of the Constitution, it contains an extensive Bill of Rights. And if you look at Section 9, subsection 9.2, states the equality, that it includes the full and equal enjoyment of all fundamental rights and freedoms. And further, looking at subsection 3, 4, and 5, refers to non-discrimination on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sex, religion, culture, sexual orientation, and so forth. And this is reaffirmed by some of the acts that we currently have, like the PEPUDA Act number 4 of 2000. And this act in particular relates to policies and protocols and codes of conduct that must take cognizance of these imperatives that we are talking about when it comes to rights and freedoms and discriminations. Further in the country, we do have the National Development Plan, Vision 2030, and the long-term vision, basically including some of the regional protocols and international treaties that South Africa is signatory to. All of these begin to identify the need to achieve gender transformation in public and private institutions, including commitment to providing an environment free from discrimination, harassment, sexual violence, while being supportive of the self-esteem and dignity of every person who is a member of these institutions. The second area that I want us to draw attention to, besides the legal frameworks that we're currently having and the regional protocols, as well as international protocols that we are signatories to, it's important for us to make sure that we adhere to the developed procedure guidelines and protocols and the code of conduct. And this must be done by not only students, but also by the university staff. And this is quite key. So it is imperative that the institutions of higher learning are, according to Small's open code, are ethically bound to create institutional frameworks in which gender and sexual related misconduct and harassing behaviors are defined. These institutions, we should look at the culture of these institutions. We should look at the attitudes towards behavior, which should actually be announced, and we should have processes of bringing complaints, and we should actually have a range of sanctions that are made clear to each and everyone should you be found guilty or having done some kind of gender-based violence and harassment inside and outside campuses. So this means that we must be able to create and implement an ethical, sensitive policy guideline, and we must take into cognizance that there shouldn't be any vague information that we pass. So everyone should actually be given information to pass through about the currently developed pieces and guidelines that we have. So 3 key things that I want to share as I conclude. The policies and these guidelines should actually make sure that they describe available prevention programs, available resources, available monitoring as well as reporting options, and further explain whether and to what extent interactions with various resources are confidential. And secondly, we need to make sure that these policy and guidelines are able to provide measure that may be able in particular cases to support and assist victims of or survivors of gender-based violence. And we must, as a community of women and men in the institutions of higher learning, commit to fostering an environment that is inside and outside campuses, that is free from gender-based violence, discrimination, including sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based violence, through reporting the incidences to the responsible office or police station. And last but not least, the Commission will continue to provide active participation in the task team, but extend our capacity and skills to conduct joint research, legal support that may be required. As a watchdog as well, we will continue to closely monitor the implementation of these instruments put before us today. I thank you, Ram Nick and colleagues.
Thanks, Tamara. Thank you very much. I think the Gender Commission is playing a very important role, both at our task team and for our institutions, because the audit findings and investigation reports only help us improve and build more systems and proper systems and control. I know we are running a bit of time, so my request is We request other people to just put yourself into time, please, and it's a huge request. My next speaker is very important because a lot in the media is spoken about universities and gender-based violence in our universities, but equally our CET colleges and our TVET colleges suffer from this pandemic enormously. And to speak about it, I invite the Deputy President of South African College of Principal Organization, Professor Futsisi. Professor Futsisi, if you can hear me, please, the platform is yours. Thank you.
Good day, colleagues, and thank you, Prof, for this opportunity. As an organization, I am here as a member of the technical task team and also as a representative of the South African Public Colleges Organization. Let me first start by saluting the Deputy Minister for Higher Education, Science and Innovation, Dr. Buti Manamela, the CEO of Higher Health, Prof. Ramnik, my boss and sister, the chairperson of the Higher Health Gender-Based Violence Technical Task Team, Prof. Puleng Linkabula. I also want to acknowledge Ms. Tamara Matebula, the chairperson of the Gender Equality. I also want to acknowledge Ms. N. Shongwe from the UN Women, Dr. Bernard Ray, the European Union representative, the leadership of TVET colleges, CET colleges, universities, and other institutions of higher learning. I also want to greet the student leadership, the interest groups, and all other relevant stakeholders. Let me just say all protocol is observed. It is important that I start first by outlining who we are and what the TVET colleges stand for, but it will be very brief. We have 50 TVET colleges across the country. And as SACPO, we represent these TVET colleges in supporting them to grow and to be capacitated enough to deliver their mandate as skills development centers of higher learning. I'm going to talk to the issue of ethics. And thanks for the presentation that was done earlier. My presentation is just to emphasize the importance of Code of Ethics as one of the instruments that are released today. It is important that there is an institutional culture which embraces protection of everyone and the protection of rights of people, and without any discrimination of any kind. Gender-based violence, it's a very complicated and sensitive subject. And having to discuss it, it is considered as a taboo. Especially in countries where there's a high emphasis on tradition and religion, that has to be respected. We, as a sector, we also believe that collecting data in terms of gender-based violence, it is quite a sensitive topic to deal with. And it often raises ethical questions and concerns around safety issues. So it is important that when we deal with survivors of gender-based violence and during interviews or any kind of interaction, we are able to respect their safety. We must be ethical in our conduct, whether in research or any other platform that we engage with. We need to respect people's rights and privacy as well. We must also ensure that the respondents during any form of interview or interaction, they are safe. There's confidentiality and there's non-discrimination and no distress experienced by any participant, whether it's in research or ordinary interviews. We have noticed that in various entities of government, where people, go for help and support in their terrible experiences as victims of gender-based violence. Sometimes they are subjected to unbearable circumstances, and issues of confidentiality, safety, and ethical conduct are not really there, or sometimes they are quite minimal. And that puts the survivors in a very difficult situation. In many ways, researching on violence against women or any persons, it is important that they are recognized as such as people who deserve respect. In the code of conduct that we are releasing today, there are a number of aspects that have been highlighted or listed for everyone to respect. I will highlight them earlier, and they were also emphasized in the previous presentation. Before undertaking any supportive intervention to the survivors of gender-based violence and to prevent re-victimization, we must ensure that there are ethical guidelines that are followed to protect both the survivors and also the professionals providing the service. Because at certain times we forget about people who are there to provide support services to our survivors. This includes respect for persons, non-maleficence, which simply means we need to minimize harm. Beneficence, we should maximize the benefits of the service that is provided. And we also must ensure that there is justice. Ethics can be defined as a code of moral values that provides a standard or rules of conduct. And this is what should guide us in our institutions of higher learning, in our organizations, in our daily living. People need to be respected. Respect for persons, it is very important, and respecting the autonomy and self-determination of people, protecting their autonomy, it is important, and respecting their being as individuals. Beneficence, we need to look into that. It is where we safeguard the welfare of people or communities that are involved in this noble act of protecting people from being abused in one way or the other. In relation to justice, we must ensure that there is, this simply relates to distributing benefits and lessening situations where people feel uneasy. In this document that we are launching today on gender-based violence, it is accompanied by the Code of Ethics. And as point of emphasis in this Code of Ethics, it's that at all campuses, all communities, people should be required to sign an institutional code of ethics. That is important, because if we take things for granted that people will automatically learn and comply, it becomes a difficult one. So it is important that students and staff sign institutional code of ethics, and those would constitute the standards of operation of behavior of people in a workplace. We must adhere to the highest ethical standards. We must respect human dignity. Compliance to rules and regulations, it's what is important. But respect for others, it is inevitable. We need to treat all persons fairly with respect, and treat all persons fairly with respect based on their, not based on discrimination against them in terms of race, gender, disability, or otherwise. As I conclude, I want to say, as the organization, we support this initiative and want to congratulate you, Prof. Ramnik, and the team of Higher Health and all members of the technical task team for having taken this initiative and ensuring that there are documents that would guide the different sectors in terms of respecting other people's rights and protecting ourselves against gender-based violence. Thank you so much
Thank
for the
you.
opportunity.
Thank you, Prof.
Again.
Thank you very, very much. In fact, I'm going to call on you to please enforce this on our 49 other rectors or principals of the TVET colleges, as well as the 9 principals in the CET colleges under your care, Deputy President of SACPO, to please make sure that these are now implemented in campuses across the TVET colleges. Thank you, Prof. Sisi, for your discussions that you have made. I think this policy will not be, this guidelines will never be practical if we do not have our leadership from students. It's not that GBV is only for young people or it affects only students, it equally affects our staff members too. But I think it's very critical that the next speaker, Siataba, who is also the Deputy President of South African Union of Students from Universities, SRC leadership, please come and engage us. Siataba, I'm going to ask you to stay in time. Thanks, Siataba. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much for presented themselves to this engagement. I would firstly like to greet the Deputy Minister, the CEO of High Health, Prof. Ramli, Chairperson of the CP of the Technical Task Force, Prof. Buleng, the Chairperson of the Commission on Gender Equality.
Siataba, we have a very big. Siataba, we have a background noise. We are not able to get you live like this. Is it possible you can find yourself in a place?
Volume, Nana. This is volume. Yes, second.
Just for a few minutes, Siataba.
Right.
Thanks.
Is it better now?
It's far better. Siataba, back to you.
All right. Apologies for that. Apologies. Before wasting further time, I would just like to observe all protocol. And I'm in my capacity, as Prof has said, as the Deputy President of the South African Students Union, and I am a member of the technical task team, and we've met a couple of times discussing way forwards in this policy, and the leadership of those before me also formed part of these engagements, and I familiarized myself with the information that is contained and also with the presentations that have come before me. First of all, as we sit here, we're still processing the shock of learning of the passing away of our fourth-year student, Stella Ndebeni, at the hands of gender-based violence. So now more than ever, we're actually reminded of the importance of the existence of these policies and protocols that govern higher institutions in higher learning. So often much, institutions of higher learning have found themselves wanting when it comes to the handling of gender-based violence cases and what constitutes such cases in terms of, is it a campus case or is it a situation that happened outside of campus? So is it part of what the university actually deals with or not? But we've learned, and even through my experience, what exactly constitutes of such cases. So I think it forms a big part of what the guidelines of gender-based violence cases that take place in institutions of higher learning. The policy also provides clear and concise methods on dealing with such cases, and it would be so fruitless for us to want to attempt to deal with these cases when we're actually not dealing with what the root cause of cases of gender-based violence on institutions of higher learning is. And I'm so happy to hear that some of the speakers that came before me actually did speak to how do we then deal with the root cause of gender-based violence in the first place. So as a South African Union of Students, we believe that we believe in offering a safe space for our students, and even in situations where gender-based violence does take place. But we want to provide a safe space for reporting and the handling of such cases, as we've seen in many institutions of higher learning, where we found students reporting that, in fact, we do report these cases of gender-based violence, but the way in which the higher institutions handle these cases, or the way in which the cases are dealt with, or the fact that there's no, sorry, I think I lost my network, sorry about that, or the fact that the way in which perpetrators are dealt with, because you go and you report a case, but you come back and you still have to attend the same class with the perpetrator or with the lecturer who has been harassing you. So the policy is so broad in such a way that it deals with cases that we would have thought are too intricate or too different from each case, and it comes and it brings them together, and we find a way in which in step one, this is what we must do. Step two, if this is that, then this is how we handle the case of the student or whatever the situation may be. So we actually look forward to the implementation of this blanket policy that will ensure that students, not from only one particular university, because there are universities that have gender-based violence policies in place, but it's not every university, and the quality in which such cases are handled each university is not the same. But we found that this policy actually offers a blanket approach that would actually ensure that all students from all universities will be treated with the same respect and with the same quality of service. Thank you so much.
Siyataba, this is so important what you have said, specifically around power dynamics that happens between the learner or our students and the examiners or supervisors or teachers or lecturers. So I think this is very, very important area. And we call on SRCs, we call on you to assist us. We will not win without you, and we are quite clear on this issue. So extremely grateful for addressing this very important area of gender-based violence from the South African Union of Students. The next speaker is a similar structure of SRC leadership in our TVET colleges. And I think without them, it is very important that even our rural campuses, our informal settlements, where our peri-urban areas, where our outreach campuses are of TVET colleges, this project reaches through the help of our SRC leadership. So I'll call on Ms. Gbv Mabasa from Satwetsa to please address us. Gbv, can you hear us?
Yes, sir, I can hear you. Am I audible?
You are, Gbv. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Ramnik. First of all, allow me to acknowledge all the protocol. And gender-based violence is a social crisis, and it has affected women in our society over years. However, it has also affected us as the students in the country. So the DHEAD, working together with SABCO, has to look into the origin of GBV in our colleges in order to ensure a GB-free society in our colleges. I will like to highlight some of the courses that we face that may lead to GBV in our colleges. As Ma'am Pelutisi mentioned that we have 50 colleges in South Africa. Our colleges in the country are many and they're scattered, and most of them are found in rural areas, whereby we have colleges without students' residence, which can lead students to stay in the private residence, which are not entirely safe for them. It makes our students to be dependent in outside people. So as the DHEAD should look into that and ensure that they provide residentials for our students. And another issue is NSFAS. NSFAS has been a route of causing GBVs in our colleges because students get dependent to outside people in order to get money to sustain their day-to-day lives in their colleges. So, which this can also pose as at the risk to be victims of GBV. So I'm happy with the implementation of the guidelines. Deputy Minister, with this, I believe that our colleges will be a safe place for the students in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Gbv. This is very important, and we call on you, and we call on every SRC president in the TVET college to ensure that you as much as the DHET, the SACPO and the college principals have to work in principle towards implementation, but I think your support and your intervention as SRCs will play a major role if we have to practically implement these deliverables into our sector, into our TVET and CET colleges. The next speaker will tell us that this is not a problem in South Africa. And as much as it's majorly a huge pandemic in South Africa, but it has got global roots. It happens in United Kingdom, it happens in United States, it happens in India, it happens in China. Gender-based violence is a global pandemic. And I think in our global pandemic, we are also grateful that the support to South Africa and our partnership with Europe, where we learn with each other, we share good practice, and they support us in our own interventions in South Africa. To call on, I'll request the Head of Cooperation, His Excellency Dr. Bernard Ray, to express and be a discussant and a message of support.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. Deputy Minister Manamela, Vice Chancellor Prof. Lenkabula, CEO of Higher Health Ramnik, all discussants, colleagues, students, friends, very happy to join today this event and this launch, and to convey the support of the European Union on behalf of the Ambassador Rina Kionka, the head of delegation of the European Union in South Africa. It's an appropriate time, Women's Month, to launch these guidelines and protocols on sexual and gender-based violence. Clearly, as was explained very clearly by all the discussants, SGBV in the sector of higher education, upset sector, is a critical challenge. And although vastly unreported, we know it's a major problem, and all of us are really saddened by what happened last week, exemplifying that situation. It's not about threatening the lives of women and men, but also impacting their education, future, as they fall victim of violence, harassment, and unfortunately, even death in many cases. So this event and the protocols and guidelines developed are part of important discussions on the need to end all forms of bullying, harassment, sexual and gender-based violence worldwide in places of higher learning. And gender-based violence is not limited to South Africa. It's a worldwide problem, we know it in Europe, and it requires both global and local strategies to find solutions. And I'm hoping that there will be exchanges between the network, the organizations of higher education of the sector of South Africa with European counterparts to discuss those and to exchange best practices, and maybe your guidelines can be used for those countries. This fit, of course, in a worldwide political agenda, and 25 years ago at the 4th World Conference for Women, we all agreed to adopt the landmark Beijing Declaration and its platform for action. But past achievements are increasingly under threat, not least now as gender inequalities as well as gender-based violence are exacerbated by the health, social, economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm proud to say that the European Union is a leader in gender equality, and we are very clear about women's rights. We consider gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls as a common value, a fundamental human right, critical to achieve social justice. These are prerequisites for poverty reduction, which remains an overall goal, and instrumental for achieving the Sustainable Development Agenda. This is why the EU has made gender equality and women's rights one of its foreign policy and development priorities across the globe. A year ago, the European Commission adopted a new action plan on gender equality and women's empowerment in our external relations for the period 2020-25. This is to accelerate progress on gender equality and women's empowerment in coherence with the strategy of gender equality. And the Gender Action Plan is implemented together between the European Union and its member states, showing our solidarity. And this, just want to show there the linkages with what we have been discussing today. The Gender Action Plan calls for a gender transformative approach. This means examining, questioning, changing rigid gender norms and imbalances of power, which disadvantage women and girls and generate discrimination at all ages, starting from early childhood in societies. This means the EU promotes change in social attitudes, including by actively engaging men and boys and by putting a focus on young people as drivers of change. Political commitment is not only one thing, but we put our money where our mouth is. We support through the Department of Women, Youth and Disadvantaged People, the people with disabilities, resources to make a critical step forward towards gender responsive planning and budgeting in all departments of the government. And for the same reasons, we are very pleased to support higher health with 27 million rounds on this endeavor. It's not only about impacting the COVID-19 effect on PST campuses, but it's really, and that's important, trying actively to change attitude, stereotypes, mechanisms, and practices to address the high level of SGBV on campuses on South Africa. And to conclude, we know universities and colleges are important settings for preventing violence. Place of learning should neither reinforce gender stereotypes nor promote or condemn any violence. And as you know, the European Union strongly condemns any form of discrimination and violence. So to conclude, we are very pleased to partner with Higher Health, support the development and implementation of these protocols and guidelines, which can lead to safer and violence-free institutions of higher health for a peaceful world. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Bernard Ray. In fact, we have to build, and we have to share our good practice with Europe, and we were very proud to partner with Europe. And as you rightfully said, if Europe Union has taken a very big lead towards gender equality, maybe it's important for us to now go there and learn what is and how do you put into your policies, how do you put those implementations towards gender equality, so that we can learn from you as much as we can share our work with you. And it's a huge partnership, and we are very proud partner with the European Union and their ethics and their ethos towards gender equality and fighting gender-based violence. So thank you, Your Excellency, for your support all the time and to support us in this difficult journey that we have embarked towards fighting this pandemic. The next speaker doesn't need any introduction. It's his vision, why we are here today. He has been absolutely instrumental from the very first day when we launched the policy of gender-based violence that was released officially in July 2020. But the building of this work with Higher Health and HAIDS previously used to be under his leadership and guidance throughout, and his vision. And he has been interacting quite enormously towards areas we need to strengthen, and specifically around behavior, prevention, and of course what we are speaking today. So ladies and gentlemen, without not delaying, I rather ask the Minister to address us, share his vision, and also the Deputy Minister to release officially these documents into practical implementation. Over to you, DM.
Thank you, Professor Ramnik, who's also a program director today. Where's the Vice Chancellor, who's the chair of the PSET Higher Health Gender-Based Violence Technical Task Team, and also the different experts who spoke to us today, Erica and Crystal Dix, the United Nations Women's South Africa Multi-Country Office, represented by Ms. N. Gituku Shongwe, and also the chairperson of the Commission for Gender Equality, Ms. Tamara Matebula, the leadership of the South African universities, students, and the leadership of the South African Vocational Education and Training Students Association, and also the leadership, vice chancellors and principals of universities and of colleges respectively. Let me extend my greetings and once again join in and indicate that as a nation we are in mourning, a nation enveloped by righteous rage, a nation that is wrestling with a stubborn lump of pain in its throat, a nation that doesn't seem to, a pain that doesn't seem to go away, a pain that arises out of the realization that one section of our society continues to be forced by another section of our society to live their lives under the paralyzing grip of fear. The fear of being attacked, the fear of being abducted, the fear of being raped, the fear of being brutally killed, and after being killed, to be cut to pieces as if you're a wild animal and having your body scattered all over the city as if you were just a stray dog. And this is the story that we've had over the last week. This is the story that's been repeated over the last months and over the last years. The story that many women in South Africa are faced with. And it's a reality that we have to ensure that we reverse, more specifically, this reality that faces young men, young girls and women in our country is a reality that requires our collective efforts and energy, and part of what we're doing today is to contribute towards reversing that reality. And as I said sometime in the week, that we, particularly as men, have no idea what it is like to live in the body of a woman, and in particular the body of a black woman. And today we are still processing the gruesomeness and the details that has come out in the murder of the 23-year-old final year law student Nosicelo Benny of the University of Fort Hare. And not so long ago, we're mourning and outraged by the murders of Zolile Khumalo, Palisa Madiba, Jesse Hess, Precious Ramabulana, and also Uyinene Mkhwechana, and many other women whose lives were brought to a violent and bloody end by men who believe they are the owners of the bodies of women and can therefore do as they please with their bodies. And we ask the question, when will this outrage end? And we must find ways of transforming and translating our mourning and legitimate rage into well thought out and transformative social and political activism. As policymakers and activists, we are required to go beyond the sensational media headlines, the populist political speak, or beyond the hashtags and begin to think critically about the genesis and impact of violence against women and its consequences for our future, for our nation and its future. And as you know, gender-based violence is a historical but also systemic and structural problem, and therefore to fully understand it, we must also understand our country, our country's history of violence and the social violence on communities and households in the form of the vulgar levels of poverty and inequality that we are experiencing. We must also understand that other grand forms of violence such as racism, capitalism and patriarchy shape and impact gender-based violence. It has now become common to refer to gender-based violence in South Africa as our own long-standing crisis or pandemic. And this reference to gender-based violence is given validity by the crime statistics. The period April to June 2021 shows that the number of rapes and sexual offenses grew at a startling rate, with 10,006 cases of rape registered in this short period. Sexual offenses crimes went up by 74% from the same period last year. And these figures do not include the incidents of rape and related sexual offenses that have not been reported. And these disturbing figures gives us a deeper appreciation for why it is extremely important for our post-school education and training institutions to take all the necessary steps to ensure that each students in their care, and in particular female students, are protected from all kinds of violence. Towards this end, in 2020, with the work that we have done with Higher Health, as the Department of Higher Education and Training, we published the policy framework to address gender-based violence in the post-school education and training system. The framework seeks to make it mandatory for all post-school education and training institutions to raise awareness about gender-based violence, prevent the occurrence of gender-based violence, and also support survivors by having procedures for reporting and dealing with gender-based violence. Drawing on this policy framework's high-level implementation plan, Higher Health facilitates the practical implementation of the framework at PSAT institutions, offering guidance, protocols, models, minimum standards, checklists, policy templates, capacitation materials, and other practical tools to post-school education and training institutions. Some of the more practical work that we have been doing include the establishment of a multi-sectoral PSAT gender-based violence technical task team, which includes representatives from the Higher Education and Training Department, Department of Women, the South African Police, the Commission on for Gender Equality, and also Universities South Africa. This task also includes the South African Public Colleges Organization, the South African Union of Students, and also the South African Technical Vocational Education and Training Students Association. And then also is extended to the South African Medical Research Council, civil society, and various representatives from the private sector. The task team is led by Professor Linkabula, who's the Vice Chancellor of UNISA, and I'm quite confident that the team will provide valuable input into the PSAT sector's response to gender-based violence, and they will enjoy our full support. We've also developed a model of practice for gender-based violence, which includes building understanding and awareness of gender-based violence issues and solutions, and is actioned by Higher Health extramural activities, which are offered across all campuses. We also have the 24-hour toll-free helpline, which is managed by Higher Health, and also which is specifically for gender-based violence and mental health, and is available in all the languages. This line offers all students health, wellness, and psychosocial risk assessment toolkits for early screening, empowerment, and referral related to gender-based violence, mental health, HIV, TB, sexually transmitted infections, substance abuse, and unplanned pregnancies, amongst other things. And where necessary, referrals are made to specialized services for physical or psychological treatment, care and support, as well as social support. We've also prepared various materials for capacitation within the context of gender-based violence, gender privilege, underreporting and normalization, myth and realities, as well as principles, institutional policies, and protocols. And to ensure that these are internalized through the higher health, we'll train human resources, unions, and frontline workers such as security, student affairs, campus housing, and many others, including student representative councils, student club leaders, first-year students, and the general student population to build knowledge, skills, and capacity to deal with gender-based violence and femicide across the PSET sector. So I was listening to some of the contribution made by the different people in the sector. One of the participants in this webinar made mention of the fact that we should be distributing some of this material even at high school level. And probably that's the work we need to do with the Department of Basic Education, because as I was engaging with the CEO of Higher Health yesterday and some colleagues, and I raised my concern around the fact that being a microcosm of society, and the Vice Chancellor and Chair of the task team said that some of these things shouldn't happen in our universities, but we are a reflection of what happens out there. And it's inevitable that if society is marred by violence, that we will be the exception. And therefore, we've got to start somewhere else, especially because most of the students who get to our higher education and training institutions have already been socialized into different practices which makes them agents of gender-based violence. And therefore, to help them unlearn those traditions and practices at this level will take even longer time. And therefore, to integrate some of these policies, some of these guidelines, at a school level is going to be very, very crucial. So it's something that we will have to have a discussion with the Department of Basic Education so that we are all able to, or gender education, that we engender in our schooling system gender education and also within its curriculum. So today's launch, which is why we're here, is basically that of the post-school education and training gender-based violence and sexual misconduct protocol, which must also be located within the broader set of government's interventions that are aimed at raising greater awareness and also intensifying action against gender-based violence. So this is not the only thing that we're doing. This is not the first thing that we're doing. It's, yes, important that we are launching it today in the context of Women's Month and also in the backdrop of some of the things that has been happening on our campuses. But it's a build-up of a series of events that we've been involved into in order to combat gender-based violence on our campuses. We, as government, are continue to drive the implementation of the pillars of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, which seeks to end gender-based violence and femicide. As government has allocated over 21 billion rand over the next 3 years to support the 6 pillars of the national strategy. Since the launch of the national strategy last year, 32 regional courts have been designated as sexual offences courts in various parts of the country. About 3,500 investigating officers receive specialized training on family violence, child protection, and sexual crime. 12 public buildings have since been renovated and repurposed to be used as shelters, and police stations have been capacitated with sexual assault evidence kits. Furthermore, these protocols must also be seen as a way of putting our gender-based violence framework for the peace sector into practice. More practically, we see the protocol as empowering individual institutions with the required capacity to combat gender-based violence and related forms of violence within their jurisdiction. While these protocols may address the reality of individual institutions, the bigger reality that resides outside the walls of academic institutions is that the problem of gender-based violence is a historical and societal phenomenon, and not one that is confined to academic institutions. For this reason, some of the issues that the interventions of individual institutions have to address is how to influence young people, and in particular young boys, to unlearn backward social, cultural, and traditional practices that do not help us to move forward as it relates to gender relations. It's the question of power that is almost at a very young age ingratiated, particularly amongst young boys, through various social and cultural and traditional practices, and in that way assumes the position of entitlement, a position of superiority when it comes to gender relations. And it is all of those things that we need to deal with. And I must emphasize that, yes, we must protect, we must preserve our cultural and traditional practices. We should not in any way undermine all of those. But in instances where some of those practices leads to the death of women in our country, we have to put a stop in some of those. It is our desire to produce a South African young man who doesn't just respect women, but also one who respects the sanctity of human life. Then our interventions must also deliberately focus on the socialization of boys, and in particular, in the socialization of boys in general. And I think this is important because gender education, gender relations have somewhat focused on what are the rights of young women, which is important, or the rights of women in general. But we should not make it a gender exclusive, because it is very crucial to help, particularly men, to unlearn some of the practices that they've accumulated over the years, which reinforces patriarchy. And if it's something that is to your benefit, it is quite difficult to unlearn, because you see it as something that benefits you, that puts you in a position of power and authority. And that's exactly where we need to be focused if we're to deal with the challenges of gender-based violence in our society. In conclusion, and like many of our nation's pressing social problems, the problem of gender-based violence is multifaceted and impacted upon by many social ills. And if we're to reduce and ultimately defeat the scourge of violence against women, one of our priorities should be to deliberately strengthen existing multisectoral partnership. And therefore, the role of everyone on campus is going to be very important. Students, workers, management, everyone. And I'm quite excited that it even extends to service providers, to private institutions, whom Ramnik, we need to engage, because this must be their Bible, so that they shouldn't say that they were not party to this. So we must engage them. They must adopt this as part of their guidelines. Individualized responses, I must emphasize, may help us to trend temporarily, but they will not help us to resolve our complex and social problems. and therefore it's important that we need a united and sustained response. Equally important, the fight against gender-based violence must be a fight that we wage every single day until until the day that we have zero rapes, that we have zero femicides, and that we are not awoken on one Saturday morning and read in the news that there is yet another woman who has been killed, chopped, and thrown into the street precisely because the boyfriend went into a jealous rage. So therefore, this must be our daily struggle that we wage so that we also help build the consciousness of South Africans on why this is an important fight for us to be engaged into. We can't hope to win this war when we continue to reduce it to a Women's Month event or a campaign of 16 days. And therefore, our commitment, and my commitment in particular, working with the task team, working with the universities, and also working with the TVET colleges, and this is also the commitment that our minister has made, is that we are going to ensure that at least within the post-school education and training sector, there's zero tolerance of gender-based violence. We must do all these things with a view to usher in a South Africa where young girls do not have to worry about whether wearing a miniskirt will result in them being harassed, being abducted, being raped, or being killed. And sometimes they don't even have to wear a miniskirt for them to be a potential victim. But that's the kind of country we hope that we will build. A South Africa where when a young girl leaves the house, the parents of that young girl don't have to worry about whether their young girl will make it home alive. A country where every young girl will be free to dream because they would be confident in the knowledge that theirs is a society that affirms their dignity and not one that subtracts them from it. And this, in my view, is the reason why we must do all these things that are contained in the protocols that we are launching today in order to build that kind of society for that young girl. Thank you very much for listening. And for interpreting.
Thank you, DM. I think you have. I think I was just reading the chat while you were speaking, DM. Everybody echoes every word that you have said, and I think it's an extremely powerful vision that you have displayed, DM, at this moment for us. I think we take note of your part, and I think what we will do is at the next technical task team meeting, we will ensure a delegation of Department of Basic Education attends to it so that there is a synergy of work, as rightfully said by the chat room as well as yourself, DM, and this works. And one more big take I take from the DM's speech or DM's address is multi-sectorality of our own intersectoral parts that we need to be engaging on these guidelines now, which includes right from security, people involved in residences and housing, people, our staff and management that's working in student affairs, SRC presidents, every layer by layer that's involved in our post-school education system. So with that, colleagues, we have run out of time, and I'm so grateful. First of all, let me acknowledge the engagement that's happened on the chat room. Taking note of every questions from whether should we have a separate GBV office, do we encourage victims not to withdraw the cases, should we build aspects of GBV into the first year experience, CET programming, CET colleges to be absolutely considered, considering their closest proximity to community. We have noted every point, and these are very valuable things. From now on, Deputy Minister, under your care, we will release these guidelines to now every institution of higher learning, every campus manager in the institutions, and we only urge and beg and plead, please implement. And now it's time for us to implement more and more. And capacity training programs will now start. right from gender offices, transformation managers, SRC presidents, management. We will be now going into a full capacity program on these implementing protocols and guidelines that have been talked about, so that we can put systems, control, and infrastructure. With that note, colleagues, the Vice Chancellor had to leave for an important assignment, and she's asked me on behalf of the technical task team to say thank you to everyone for joining. I would like to close the session. We will take a little bit of media while they are here, but thank you to the media houses who streamed us. Thank you to the media houses for taking this engagement to next level, but the DM will be here for media engagements. With that note, colleagues, thank you very much, and I will officially close this session with everyone. Thank you.